Hello and welcome back everyone, we Weeb Online, and today I'm gonna continue the story What If Naruto Mastered How to Edit Seals Part 11. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and to watch more videos like this, subscribe to my channel and turn that bell notification on so you never miss an upload. Now wasting no more time, let's begin.
The first thing they saw was, of course, the bridge, which stretched over the rushing water and into the village. The morning fog rose in snake-like strands that stuck to the ground in the cold concrete of the huge building. Two wolves on each side of the bridge stood at attention in front of the bridge. On the right, a small building had been built, where they could see two more. It was obviously a checkpoint, but a small list of fees written in clear print on a sign near it made it seem like it might also be a toll booth. Since Tsukiyomi had asked for them to come, she wasn't even going to worry about it. He could pay the fee himself if he wanted them there. The wolves didn't move toward the group coming toward them, so it seemed like they agreed. The group of 10 in Izuka made it across the bridge without any problems. When they reached the top, they got their first look at the village that would be their home for anywhere from a few weeks to decades. It looked clean enough, and the few buildings they could see that needed to be fixed were in the process of being fixed. A little farther away from the village was a man-made clearing where they could see workers adding trash to piles and scavengers going through them. Set near the water, a small group of villagers were seen loading two different boats onto a small dock. One seemed to have things that could be used, and the other seemed to have trash. This was still pretty new, and she had heard about the recent change in ownership. It looks like that change was very helpful. Part of her mind made the connection that this was the village of Nami no Kuni, the same Nami no Kuni she was going to be in charge of for Tsukiyomi. It felt strange, but it wasn't bad. All of this was now her job, and everyone was counting on her to take care of them. It was a scary thought, and she wouldn't lie and say she wasn't a little scared, but she was also excited to be able to leave her mark here, hopefully as the first of many leaders who would help this country grow. As she and her friends kept looking at the village from a distance, a wolf with a red fur mantle came up to them. He called out, "Governor Inuzuka," as he got closer. "Welcome to Nami no Kuni. I hope you didn't run into any trouble on your way here." Hana replied to her, which was clear, "Governor." Tsukiyomi-sama suggested it. "It could be Duchess, if you want, but we'd have to run anything else by him first." No, Governor is fine." "Why did he pick that?" "It sounded good to him," she said. She could feel the smile behind his mask. "I see. Our trip went without a hitch." "Oh, I'm sorry," he said. He put out his hand, and she took it firmly. "I'm Commander Sai, and I'm in charge of the wolves. From now on, we'll be working together a lot." "Sure, it will be fun." "I thought Tsukiyomi Dono was in charge of the wolves." "Yes, he was. When it became clear that he didn't have enough time to oversee all of his projects himself, he gave me the job. And that's where Mai comes in." Her voice had a hint of irritation when she said the name of the young woman. It was one thing to work for a shady group, but it was just weird to date her mother. "I see you've met her," it said, assuming the wolf would notice how annoyed she was. "Yes, that's where she comes in. I'll call them project heads for simplicity's sake, but they all report to her so that Tsukiyomi-sama can focus on our group's future." "So you're in charge of one of these projects?" "Yes." He nodded. "So are you. Will it be hard for you to report to Mai and follow her orders?" "No, I'll manage." "Okay, if you don't mind my asking, what did she do to make you mad?" "Only if I can ask you a question about her," she said. Sai nodded, so she kept talking. "She went on a date with my clan head." "Your mother is the head of your clan, right?" "You're right." "Your mother," he said again and again. "She went on a date with your mother. That's strange. Why on earth would she do that? Isn't that the norm? I know she can be very playful with people she likes, but this is the first time I've heard of her going on a date. The fact that it's with an older woman makes things even stranger." "Oh, really? What's wrong with my mom?" "Oh, no, that's not it at all. It's just not what she was interested in before," he said with a frown. "She seemed to like Naruto-san, who is younger than her, and she spends as much time as she can with Tsukiyomi-sama. I'm pretty sure those two are more than just friends at this point, but her liking a woman seems out of character, and I thought I knew her better. Maybe Tsukiyomi life Dono's just wasn't going well and she needed a break?" "Ah, yes, that might be it," he said with a smile hiding behind his mask. If he was no longer in her life, it would explain why she was acting the way she was. She likes to cuddle, and if your mother is even half as pretty as you, she would be a great choice. Hannah tried to get out of her mind the idea of them getting married one day. Things would be very awkward if the girl was younger than she was. It could have been a complicated plan to keep her here in Wave. She gave a small snort and shook her head. That was just silly. As long as she doesn't turn out to be my second mom. Don't worry. I don't think Mai would be able to follow through with such a commitment. She's already too invested in Tsukiyomi-sama and his plans. Well, I guess that's one less worry. I suppose it is. You had a question about Mai, I believe? Yeah, that's right. Why did he choose her, Tsukiyomi Dono? She can't be older than me, but he's given her control over you, your wolves, and anyone else who is with him. Sai gave it a quick thought. She knows what she's doing, he finally said, and she's shown it over and over again. I think the more likely reason is that he likes her. She's been his assistant from the start, so he's probably grown fond of her. I guess that's a good enough reason. If he trusts her, why wouldn't he? Yes, that's right. Now, do you want me to take you to your temporary home? Temporary? Even as he turned to lead them away, he gave them a nod. Oh, yes. We've started building a home and office for you and your friends, but it's not quite ready yet because Tsukiyomi-sama just decided to offer it to you. I'd say it'll be ready in a few more weeks. He's paying well for the locals to work on this project. Then where are we going to stay? Gato had a small mansion built that was surprisingly well protected, considering he's a civilian businessman, and we wolves have been staying there. You'll be welcome to stay with us, which is good. It's the most well-protected place in the country, considering how many wolves stay there even when they're not on duty. It's also where Gato kept all his papers, so it's where the two of us mostly you would have to start as we try to. And where does that go? Really, it doesn't matter which way the people want to go. It will help them accept us and show them that they still have their own freedoms while giving us the money we need for other projects. We give them the chance, they start to grow and expand, and then with our guidance we make sure everything goes smoothly. So you really take your role as a guide seriously by giving advice and opportunities and letting people decide whether or not to follow them. Sai was quiet for a moment as he thought about how to say it best. Well, no, not exactly. The people decide how, but we wolves need progress to grow. There's also the matter of making sure people don't do things that could hurt them. To that end, they can do what they want as long as they're doing something, but there are some things we can't stand, and when they cross that line, we step in. Then there doesn't seem to be much ruling. What am I supposed to do? No, I'm not doing much ruling right now. Your job is to work with me and the wolves to make sure everything runs smoothly. Is that going to be hard? I don't think there will be too many problems. So far, we haven't had any. The people are happy to work together to fix all the damage Gato did. Unfortunately, we can't expect it to stay this way forever. Sooner or later, there will be fights as everyone tries to get ahead of their neighbors. That's when the real work begins. Luckily, we get a head start, and the better foundation we can lay and the more growth we have to add variety, the better off everyone will be. Makes sense, I guess. When do we start? Tsukiyomi-sama is leaving in a few days, and he wants you and your companions to be settled and familiar with the country before he does. So, I'll probably have you start as soon as he's out of sight. Like I said before, the sooner we get this done, the less we'll have to fix in the long run. Okay. That makes sense to me. As their heiress talked with the wolf, the other members of the Inuzuka clan kept quiet. When the two stopped talking, the quiet didn't end. It near the same time that buildings began to surround them. Ah, here we are in the real village, said Sai. I'd like you all to pay attention to your surroundings so you can get used to them. This will probably be your home for a while, and it's always a good idea to know where you are. Even though no one else spoke, the leader of the wolves didn't seem to mind. Even though it was still early in the morning, the streets were full of people. This wasn't too surprising, given how much the village depended on fishing, and it was clear that everyone was happy with how things were going. As rumors spread, laughing kids ran between people's legs and excited chatter filled the air. There were already a few restaurants open, and the smells of spices that had been out of reach for so long drew people in. All that happiness was, of course, ruined by the sight of wolves sitting on roofs in a way that was as out of place as gargoyles on a farmhouse. People in Wave didn't seem to pay much attention to the quiet watchers on their roofs, but they did notice the people who walked the streets. Almost none of the adults who walked by the wolves seemed to get close to them or talk to them if they could help it. Even though they were scared, the wolves kept checking goods, catching the occasional thief, and breaking up fights between drunk dockworkers who had just finished their night shift. On the other hand, the kids were much more friendly. Hana saw a shinobi teaching a group of young boys how to use their kunai as they huddled around a wolf that was crouched down by a fence in one alley. They all had big smiles on their faces, and they were all eager and excited to learn. Two more wolves stood watch nearby as a group of giggly girls braided their long hair and put flowers in it. The only response they got was when the male wolf took off the flower circlet he had carefully made and put it on top of his female companion's head. Naturally, a new circlet was placed on his head seconds after. Both of them didn't seem to care. Hana couldn't help but smile as she watched. She was worried, but maybe it wouldn't be as bad as she thought. A lot of what he was drinking got past his lips. He hadn't seen his old rival in a long time, and he couldn't help but feel a little bit nostalgic. On the other hand, his rival didn't seem to agree with him. Strange, because people usually thought he was the one without feelings. "What did you want now, Danzo?" His rival had been looking older and older lately, and he asked him what he wanted. He thought that was a sign that he was also getting too old for this. Both of them would have to find replacements, or, if the gods were kind, they would have to find a single person who could do both of their jobs. I hope, though, that they won't keep them as long as the two rivals did. That was just too much work. He couldn't help but wonder if Naruto would run into the same problem or if he had already solved it. He knew how stressful it was to run his own organization, and even though he did most of Naruto's work for him, he had a lot more experience than the young man. Oh well, at least it made him stand out as a possible replacement. He would probably take on the role even if no one asked him to. He thought it was only right that the dark side of Konohagakure had another person who knew how important shadows were. The darkness gave freedoms that the light didn't, but it also had rules that kept people tied to it. Maybe Naruto could find a middle ground, even if it was just to give him the freedom he needed to support his village. I just heard some news that I thought you might be interested in. I doubt Jiraiya's network has picked it up yet, and even if it has, you probably won't get the report until next week, unless he thinks it's important enough to tell you right away. Hiruzen raised one brow and asked, "If it's not urgent, why would you bring it to my attention yourself? A letter would have been enough, even if you thought I might be interested." Danzo admitted, "It's not always important. I just thought it was interesting and wanted to tell you in person." It didn't take the old Sarutobi long to try to figure out why. Naruto is involved in some way, isn't he? The Yami no Shinobi replied with a smile from Danzo. Hiruzen had to let out a groan, which made the old shinobi laugh even more. "Okay," said the Sandaime with a sigh. "What was it that you wanted me to know?" "Do you know what's going on in Nami no Kuni, right?" asked the leader of Root. "Yes, I am." Hitaki Kakashi's report on Team 7's recent C rank to a rank change gave me a general idea of what happened. "How short?" The Sandaime Hokage said, "It was Kakashi," as if that was enough to explain everything. He wasn't wrong, but he still explained himself without being asked. "Very brief." "Just what did he say to you?" Hiruzen answered, but he did so with suspicious eyes. Team 7 took the bridge builder Tazuna from Konoha to Wave. The mission was successful, but it was complicated by the appearance of the demon brothers Guzu and Maizu and then later by one Momochi Zabuza. In the end, Gado, the tycoon who had been ruling Nami no Kuni with an iron fist, was taken care of, and Zabuza was driven away after taking serious but not fatal damage. Sarutobi took a short break before giving a shrug. Kakashi also liked to say that all of his genin were terrible failures and that he would have done better if they were all burned logs. There was something about the worm in his report, but I don't know what he was talking about or how it had anything to do with the mission. Really? That's all. He talked in great detail about how he won over the client's daughter. He said that her behind was so good that he almost sent his genin team back with his headband so he could stay there. Danzo said, "That is worrying. It's hard to believe that one of our best would be tempted to leave us for a woman from the outside." After a moment of silence, Hiruzen said in a quiet voice, "He must have been one hell of a prick." Danzo didn't even think twice before nodding his head to show that he agreed. "Do you think we could get her to join Konoha? A weapon like that would work better than any Jinchuriki. When weren't we at war? Maybe something to do with office work," the Warhawk thought. "A job that would require her to move around a lot would be great for her morale." "I can't believe you're even thinking about it." He replied, "I can't believe you're not. Can we please talk about why you came here? I don't think you came to talk about an ass." Kakashi tapped. Danzo did look a little embarrassed when he realized where their conversation was going, which was a good sign. "Oh, yes, I got a little off track there. What Kakashi told you is mostly true, but he left out some important details that aren't directly related to his mission of protecting the bridge builder. You should know him well enough to know that. Hiruzen wasn't surprised, but he had to wonder if that was just Kakashi and he shouldn't have given him a team, or if Kakashi was acting this way on purpose because he didn't want a team. Both answers were bad, but the second one was better because it wasn't his fault. But what didn't he say? Gato's Iron Fist, as he called it, was kept in place by a pack of wild dogs in Konoha. Who are they? Exact same, Danzo replied. Gato hired them a while ago, and since then they've been his goons. They just let Team 7 finish their job. More likely, Team 7 helped them finish theirs, I'd say. Hiruzen rubbed his chin lightly as he thought about this, and then it hit him. They waited around to betray Gato, didn't they? In fact, when Gato gathered his group to crush the last wave of resistance in Wave, the wolves took the chance to kill him and everyone with him. The Sandaime said, "There's more you're not telling me. The wolves have taken over the country, and their leader, whose name is Tsukiyomi, is protecting it." The professor laughed at the name's arrogance. Then Wave belongs to them. So what? It can't be much worse than when Gato was in charge. Oh, no, Nami no Kuni is doing great, or at least as well as my spies are allowed to see. Hiruzen's one eyebrow went up in question. As long as my men stay near the village, the wolves don't do much more than give a Konoha salute when they pass, but if they try to enter the village, they are pushed out with a lot of force. Oh, I see. How does this have anything to do with Naruto? You and I both know that Naruto has something to do with the wolves. I won't say I didn't have my doubts. There are no doubts, he's involved. I've seen his wolf guard and trained them, so I know for sure. That caught Hiruzen's eye. He asked with a narrowed brow. You seem to know more about the wolves than I do, so tell me about them. At one time, they were root agents in training. Despite my best efforts, I was not able to successfully condition them, so they kept most of their emotions, Danzo said with a light shrug. There aren't many people who can be trained well and made to feel little or nothing, which is why my operation has so few. I let the rejects go back into the Konoha population to live as regular people. I thought that, if nothing else, having shinobi-trained civilians would help in a crisis because they could help the Konoha shinobi get their fellow civilians to safety. The Sandaime didn't like what he heard, but he couldn't deny that it was a good idea. There were worse ways to use the scraps from Danzu's illegal pet project. Ignoring the fact that you kept working with Root even though it was disbanded and that you seem to have trained far more operatives than you have under your control, how did they become the wolves? At first, they were still under my control, Danzo said. But then this Tsukiyomi was able to take them away from me. He's the one who made the wolves. So Tsukiyomi uses your trained operatives to make a small army for himself. How does Naruto fit into this? That's the one thing I just don't understand. Isn't that clear? Naruto is Tsukiyomi. Hiruzen gave him a strange look. Before you told me, I would have believed you, but I don't understand how he could have taken control of them. Root was broken up in part because you used seals to keep your operatives under control. I doubt you would even try to train someone without taking similar steps. Yet Naruto has found a way to change the seal. I don't know if it's still in effect or if it's been completely cancelled, but they'll stick with him now. And a nation. Danzo smiled. Yes, and a nation. You do, however, have a good chance because of this. After the last few wars and the loss of so many shinobi in the Uchiha massacre, Konoha's finances are not in great shape. Soon, the effects will be felt. We have it better than Suna and Iwa, but that won't always be the case. So you think I should make some kind of deal with Wave through Naruto? Exactly. And this isn't a plan to put your own spies in better places in Nami no Kuni, is it? Well, that would help, said the Yami no Shinobi. But even though I think it's important to watch him, I don't think Konoha would be in a lot of trouble if we didn't. He is more likely to join our side than to fight against us. What leads you to believe that? From what I can tell, he doesn't have anyone left in Konoha except for maybe Azuki Yugo, who was his temporary sensei during the academy, or Mitarashi Anko, who seems to like the boy and likes to take him on missions. Because, despite all this, Konoha is his home, and wolves can be very possessive of their homes. You're counting on him to be possessive, Hiruzen said after a short pause. And Tsukiyomi. Do you have evidence for either one? He seems to be very possessive, and I'm sure that he and Tsukiyomi are the same person. You asked me what the wolves were, so here's the answer. The wolves are Naruto's personal army. A deep sigh left Hiruzen's lips. I thought that might happen, so let's hope you're right. By the gods, let's hope you're right, because Konoha isn't ready for an attack right now, especially from the inside. He wouldn't find out about the Hyuga clan's problems until it was too late for him to help. The house was quiet, much quieter than it should have been. Unfortunately, she was getting used to it. Gone were the days when she and her brother laughed and pounded their feet as they played, and her mother's lullabies no longer filled the air. Naruto, who was studying more, no longer called to her from the back garden to come in for dinner. No, she ate dinner alone at the table in silence. Her brother hadn't been here in over 4 years, and her mother only came home late at night to sleep after a quick shower. She usually left before breakfast. The house was nothing like what she remembered or what she had dreamed about during the 4 years that her mother taught her the kunoichi arts while they traveled the world. She had never imagined that their home would be so cold and lifeless. But it had turned into that. With her brother gone and her mother always away taking care of clan business for the Uzumaki in Yamanaka, she had the house to herself, which was the dream of many girls her age. Naruko had never felt so alone before, even when she went to see the Yamanaka heiress. She was always busy with work and glad for any chance to take a short break. Even Mito, who was locked inside her and could have talked at any time, wouldn't say a word. She probably still held that mistake she made during the sparring match against her, and there was no way for them to get along again until Mito was returned to her brother. Since she would spend most of her time thinking about her brother from then on, it was unlikely that they could get back together. No, that bridge was completely burned, and she was stuck on the other side, lost and alone. All of this would be so much easier if she still had her brother. She had always looked to him for advice and would gladly follow his lead. His path, however, had no room for her right now. She would only get in the way. The worst part was that her absence from his life was part of the reason he was on that path, and every day it seemed like he was getting farther and farther away, never to be found again. She was an Uzumaki, though, and those people never gave up. Even on her deathbed, she would get him to like her again, so she decided that the first step to getting closer to him was to stop her mother from making him even less interested in her. No matter how well-intentioned her mother's actions might be, they would make it impossible for her to make any progress toward her goal of having a family with as many members as possible. She didn't have to help, of course. Her mother was doing enough to wear herself out, and Naruko was sure that even without her, Kushina would wear herself out enough to be able to think about what she was doing. Her mother was so desperate that she never seemed to fully think out her plans, and while her determination was admirable to an Uzumaki, it was hurting more than helping. So, even though her mother would stop soon, that didn't mean she would stop soon enough. Every attempt risked hurting their already deteriorating relationship with Naruto even more, and the sooner she stopped, the sooner the damage could be fixed. Still, Naruko wasn't a morning person, so getting up before her mother wasn't an option. Also, she'd spent the day helping the Yamanaka run the clan and take care of Uzumaki properties that hadn't been looked after in years, so it would be rude to keep her from taking a shower and getting some rest. With that in mind, Naruko decided she didn't have much of a choice but to stay up all night. As Naruko got ready for the day, the light from her mother's room shone through the bottom of the door. She only took her eyes off the door long enough to look at the clock, as if her mother would disappear if she wasn't paying enough attention. "I could not have woken up at 3:45, she said. She was told this was the best thing to do, even though her eyelids strongly disagreed. It's not a good idea to train hard during the day if you want to stay awake all night. She waited anxiously for her mother to come out of her room. After spending the whole night doing nothing, it was only natural that she realized she didn't know what she was going to say to her mother. She didn't have time to worry about it, though, because the door was creaking and light was spilling into the hallway. "Naruko?" Kushina was surprised to see that her daughter was waiting outside her room. "Good morning, Ka-chan. It's been a while since I saw you last." Maybe a little guilt would get the woman to stop and think about what she was doing. The guilt seemed to be working, as she looked down at her daughter. "I'm sorry, my little sunflower, but I have had a lot to do. Did you want or need something?" Even though she had just woken up, Kushina looked tired and worn out. With 2 clans to deal with and the stress of Naruto's absence on top of that, it was easy to see why. Naruko's use of an old nickname and the look of guilt on Kushina's face only made Naruko feel bad about taking this route. Her mother was already dealing with a lot. "I just think you've been doing too much," he said. That was probably both a great understatement and a subtle hint that she was going too far. Unfortunately, most Uzumaki didn't know how to be subtle, and it was only because of her sensei's constant subtle jabs and insults that she had learned it herself. "I have to do a lot if we want your brother back. She meant well, but her methods were all wrong. Just telling her that would have been enough, but Naruto made a pretty big mistake. I get it, but after talking to Ino, I think you might be going about this the wrong way. And that was the end of the conversation, because she had brought up the Yamanaka, whom her mother was currently blaming for everything. Even though Naruto seemed to get along fine with the Mindwalkers, Kushina seemed to take all her anger out on them. Oh, I see. So you think I'm wrong because that little snot tells more lies about my son, who is your brother, right? Naruto couldn't answer because her mother ran away in a rage. She sighed in defeat and fell to the ground. Even though they both missed Naruto and wanted him back, the family was still falling apart. There was no chance that they could ever be a happy family again. The end had come for the Uzumaki family. Maybe it was always like that, ever since that day 4 years ago when they left a clan member behind and gave up everything they used to believe in. The tears didn't stop when I thought about that. The tightness in her chest and the sting of unshed tears in her eyes were nothing compared to the regret that was already eating away at her stomach. She knew that she shouldn't have been so mad, especially at her own daughter. Just as much as she wanted her son back, Naruto also wanted her brother back. It wasn't the girl's fault that the Yamanaka heiress was the closest thing she had to a friend. It also wasn't her fault that the Yamanaka were the best people to ask about Naruto because they knew him better than anyone else. But logic doesn't have much to do with how people feel. She couldn't help but feel angry when the clan she blamed most for her son's death was mentioned, and she couldn't help but feel betrayed when her daughter seemed to hang out with them more than with her own mother. It should have been expected, since she was rarely around these days because she was either working on clan business or trying to figure out how to get her son back to the clan. In a way, it kind of was. What she didn't expect, though, was for her daughter to get along well with the Yamanaka heiress. When she first got back to the village with her, she would have been happy to hear that the two young kunoichi were getting along. But when she found out that they had helped her son leave the clan, she couldn't help but hate them. When she found out that Naruto no longer had anything against the clan and was even getting along with them, things got even worse. Well, they were scared of him, as they should have been, but they didn't want to upset him, and he was able to use them to his advantage. The most important thing is that he wasn't mad at them. In fact, he had said that he should probably thank them for what they had let him do and become. And while she was glad that he had grown up to be a good young man she could be proud of, she was also sad that he had grown apart from his family to the point where he not only didn't want anything to do with them, but had gone out and found someone else to take their place. When the young heiress talked about the wolves before her clan became a vassal to her own, all the Yamanaka at the table tensed up. This was the only family that could have been the wolves. Criminals. Her little boy was hanging out with criminals so much that he would call them family instead of her, his own mother. He seemed happy, too. As if losing them didn't mean anything at all. That hurt more than anything else. To find out that her son didn't care about his family or her and had just moved on to the next group. She knew it was wrong to hope that he was upset about them going missing, but that would have been expected and, at this point, even welcome. What she didn't know how to deal with was his simple apathy and the professional way he talked to her when she finally found him again. It was making her feel terrible. She made plans and put them into action as soon as she could in an effort to get back what she had lost, but none of them worked, and none of them helped her get closer to her goal of having a whole family. Now she was about to lose her daughter. She wasn't so busy with her work that she didn't notice how far away she was getting from the young kunoichi she had been training for the past 4 years. She didn't want to say it, but she had to. Her son was already dead, and the kunoichi part of her knew that and told her to move on. But she still had her daughter. Every time she tried to get her son back, she spent less time with her daughter, which broke up what little family she had left. It wouldn't be long before she lost both of them and was on her own in the world. Just like Naruto was. She couldn't just give up on the idea of getting her son back because she felt guilty, loved him, and was a mother. However, at this point, losing her daughter would be much, much worse. And that thought hurt, just like every other thought about her family. Even though she meant to, she had left her son on his own for 4 years. There were probably worse places for her to leave him. Compared to the other villages, Konoha was pretty friendly, but that didn't make things better. She had left her family, even though she was the leader of the Uzumaki clan. If there had been any other adults in the clan, she would have been expected to give up her role as head and leave. Just like her son had done. When he got into a fight with another Konoha clan, he decided to leave the clan on his own. It was a great example for any clan member who wasn't named Uzumaki. Other clans might agree with him or even call him a hero because he was able to win in the end without bringing the clan into it. The Uzumaki, on the other hand, never left each other. If one person had a problem, they all did, and they would fight until the end to solve the problem. If Naruto had wanted to say that he and by extension the whole Uzumaki clan were the Yamanaka's enemy, the clan would have stood proudly behind him. But there wasn't a group, just him. She had already sent her daughter from the village on a 4-year training trip. And because it was just him, he had cut himself off from their name and taken the whole fight on his young shoulders. She didn't like it as an Uzumaki. As a Kunoichi, she was okay with it. As a mom, she felt bad about herself. In the end, she knew that this was all her fault, no matter how hard she tried to blame others. Everything that had happened was all her fault, and she was the only one to blame. Even though she tried to deny it, the truth was always there, whispering to her as it got harder and harder to keep going. She really wanted to just give up, curl up in a ball, and shut out the world. But she couldn't. She had made this mess, so it was her job to clean it up, no matter how hard it was or how long it took. And her daughter suffered the more she worked at it and put everything she had into it in a desperate attempt to change what had already happened. She was hurt. The same way Naruto had. Didn't it all come back to him? She had thought about blaming him for this mess a few times, but he was just the source of the pain, not the cause. All of these problems were caused by things outside of his control. She could blame clans like the Yamanaka or the Senju, but she couldn't really blame her son. He was the one who got hurt the most in this situation. Not her, not her daughter, and especially not those who had gone against him. He had been hurt, but not anymore. He had moved on and made a life for himself away from all of that. She was happy for him, but was it right for her to be happy? The only thing she did to shape the young man into a shinobi was leave him alone, which was not something to be proud of. Naruto was as lost as it was possible to be, and every day her daughter got further and further away. After all these years, the last pieces of the Uzumaki clan, the greatest clan that ever lived, were falling apart and crumbling to nothing. She knew this deep down in her heart, in a place she didn't want to acknowledge. Knew that she was to blame, and her children were the ones who had to pay. If she could go back to when they were a whole family, she wouldn't think twice about it. If she had known then what she knows now, she would have never left her son's side. At that time, they would have all been together and happy. But it was too late. She couldn't change what she had done wrong. She also couldn't accept them or the terrible fact that her children were now suffering because of her. She even started to wonder if she should give up one child to keep the other. If she had to choose between the two, did she deserve either one? In the end, she could only keep trying, hoping that one day she would be able to make things right. That maybe one day they would be a family again. But deep in her heart, in the same place where she knew it was all her fault, was the truth she wasn't strong enough to know because she was afraid it would break her completely. They were already gone, and she couldn't do anything about it. Over the last 2 weeks, he had grown to like the ocean air and the port town itself. Maybe it was because people's lives were so simple here, or because everyone was so happy compared to the usual gloomy village, or maybe it was just because it was his, and that simple thought gave him the same sense of freedom that the people who had been forced to live under Gato's rule now felt. He knew that Hana, the Inuzuka heiress, had also grown attached to the small village in the short time she had been there. This made him happy, but he knew that he wasn't the only one. He could understand it, because she was probably feeling the same sense of responsibility he had when he took charge of the rejected root candidates who would later become his wolves. Only this, a town that was the center of a country, or the closest thing Nami no Kuni had to a capital, felt like a much bigger responsibility than a simple organization, no matter how big it grew. Something about a real village, with permanent buildings that stood out in the light instead of in the shadows where he had become so comfortable, made him feel so much more secure. There was a sense of responsibility that came with being in charge, but it hadn't seemed so real to him until he saw the faces of the civilians who now depended on him. Even though he wanted to look out for them, his wolves could take care of themselves, and he could always trust them to do what was best for the pack. But civilians weren't as self-sufficient because they weren't trained and didn't know what their silent protectors were really like. They looked to those in charge to help them get through their simple lives. Unlike the Hyuga clan, whose sheep flocked to a shepherd, this group of people just needed to be reassured and made to feel safe so they could live their lives as best they could. And even though Tsukiyomi, as they knew him, couldn't do that, Hana had risen to the challenge in a great way. Everyone in Wave loved her. Even though they were wary of the wolves, they didn't necessarily dislike them. It helped the people's morale a lot to be able to put a face to the village's leaders, though. Naruto was surprised that the people hadn't done a Hyuga and made the Inuzuka heiress a goddess, given how high morale went after Gato died and how Gato's money was used to bring Wave back to what it once was and toward what it could become. Even though he thought that was good, he couldn't even think about how hard it would be to lead a group with two different goddesses and cults. That would be a nightmare from an organizational point of view. From under the black hood of his traveling cloak, his purple eyes looked around. From afar, he could see the villagers going about their daily lives, worried mostly about what they would eat for dinner that night or how they would look to their crush. It was a nice change from both the sad Wave that he had heard about and the happy celebrations that were going on when he first got there. No, this simple happiness was much better for the port town. A town full of sailors and fishermen wasn't the best place for big village-wide parties where alcohol was freely available from Gato's stores. That was a pretty bad thing for his wolves to do, and he didn't want to do it again, but the village needed it, and it helped them in the end. When he turned away from the streets of Nami no Kuni's only official town, he took a quick look at the nearby carriage that would take him on his journey to become the ruler of Wave. It was easy, but it was a bore. The carriage was made to look as plain as possible with a lot of care. Even though it was well taken care of, the only thing that stood out was how average it was. Even though the average person might not notice, the lords and families who lived in the capital cities would notice that the carriage was kept clean and well kept with great care. He didn't need anything flashy to show his power or to get people's attention. The dark gray carriage set him apart from the rest of the crowd, but it also showed that he had better things to do than waste his money. He wasn't there to hang out with less important lords or compete in piss-offs with the heirs of famous families. No, he was going to be there to talk to the daimyo and take care of business that most people could only dream about. His carriage, which was intimidating in its simple perfection and was only marked by the head of a wolf in a lighter gray, showed a grim seriousness that would never be matched by the wealthy nobles who lived well off the good deeds of their ancestors. They didn't have what it took to stand across from the daimyo as a possible ally instead of next to him as just another waste of space hoping for his favor. He was better than them in ways that they didn't understand. Even though they probably tried to outdo each other all the time, his carriage would tell them right away that he didn't want to join in their sad games. He wouldn't join them because he was already playing a game that was much more advanced than anything they could offer. Yes, this carriage would be just right for him. Not to mention the many hidden explosive tags that were ready to cause mass panic and chaos if they needed to get out. Who can say? He might use it to threaten the daimyo if things go wrong, or he might even use it to get rid of him. He briefly thought about replacing the man and his family with hanged wolves and getting rid of any staff member who seemed suspicious. No, that was a little too much. At least for the moment. He would remember that option in case something terrible went wrong, or he would save it for a time when he wasn't so busy. He didn't like how hard it was to control a man who was pretending to be a greater daimyo but was actually your ally and supported your position as daimyo. Hanada had a hard time taking care of the Hyuga who followed him because he had to stay anonymous and he wasn't a natural leader. He didn't have to do much on that end right now, or he wouldn't have had time to fix things here in Wave and then go talk to one of the world's rulers. For sure, the greater daimyo were the most powerful people in this world. They had greater hidden villages at their disposal and armies of samurai ready to die on their orders, and because they had so much money, they could even pay other countries to fight for them so they wouldn't have to kill any of their own people. It was almost scary how much power those simple men had at their fingertips, ready to be let loose on the world. If even one of them was ambitious enough, war would start in a week and spread to the whole world. People who have never really fought or struggled should not have that kind of power. Not surprisingly, just thinking about their power made him want to take it from them even more. After he got help, he might go after one of the other greater daimyo and use a replacement to take control of their country. He probably wouldn't tell the person who helped him that, though. He wouldn't be liked by the man at all if he knew that. On the other hand, the Lord of Lords would probably like smaller countries, and even if he kept it a secret from the rest of the world, there was too much goodwill to be gained to keep his backer in the dark. Sadly, those were plans and ideas for a different time. He had to start from the beginning and then plan for how they would grow. Still, there was no way to know how the world would react when the wolves were out in the open. Some of their old employers might be happy that they can easily get in touch with them again, while others might worry that their past involvement with the group will come to light and make them look bad. After he took care of that, he could start planning what was beginning to sound like an attempt to take over the world. Even though it wasn't his goal, he didn't have anything against the idea. It wouldn't hurt, and if nothing else, he could play with the idea as a way to pass the time on the way there. Using a carriage meant that he would have to move at a rather normal speed. The next 2 weeks would be very long. From the carriage, he looked at the few people who were around him. Unlike when Team 7 left, his wouldn't be marked by a big group of happy people. People didn't like him because he was just a name and had no face. Hannah was their leader, and he was the man who stood behind her in the shadows. People could see that he was supporting her, but that was all they knew about him. After what happened with Gato and his thugs, they knew the wolves were there to protect them, but they didn't want to accept them. Few people helped the wolves because they helped them when they worked for Gato. Those people were thankful. Hannah seemed to be the one the wolves worked for, or at least with. If Hannah had been the one leaving, he was sure that even after only a week of getting to know the people and being introduced as their leader, they would all get together to wish her well. After all, that was her job as the leader they could all look up to and admire. His group might be moving toward the light, but he wouldn't join them. His place was in the shadows, where he would sneak around and make sure no one saw what was needed for their light to exist. He had to admit that it made him a little sad, but it was the price he had to pay for what he had done, and it was a price he would gladly pay for the good of his wolves. He belonged in the shadows, and that's where he would spend the rest of his life. He knew that these leaders would one day take his place in the eyes of the people he led. Already, he was thinking of ways for Sai to give new recruits seals that were the same as the one he wore. This would mean that those wolves wouldn't see him unless they were given a task that involved him, which was unlikely given how young they were. No, they would only hear about him from the older wolves. They would be told that tasks were his will, even though they had never met him. Over time, they would stop talking about him, except when they would whisper his name as if it were a prayer to a god they used to believe in but no longer did. Only his top leaders would know better, but how long would that last? How long until only Sai knew that he was watching over the wolves and leading them toward an uncertain future? When would Mai, who everyone thought led this large group, show up? When the flock and their goddess came to her for guidance, when the wolves followed her, and when the Inuzuka, who were on their side, could only vaguely remember the man who started it all. Sume would know the name, but she might not pay much attention to it because she had never met him. Instead, she would think that the young woman she had met was and always had been the real leader hiding among the ranks. Hannah, on the other hand, had met him briefly when he told her he believed in her and Wave's future, and she might remember the hooded person who had given her the job. Hinata would remember him, he was sure of that. She was the goddess of the Hyuga, after all. But what did that matter? Her people wouldn't know about him, and as she got better at her job, she wouldn't need him as much. Eventually, she would only need to report to Mai. He already had a general idea of how to give Sai the ability to add the seal. How long would it be before those he had brought together forgot about him and he became a forgotten figure? While they all moved into the light and lived their lives in the open, unhindered by secrets or the fear of being unprepared for possible enemies, he would be stuck in the shadows until the day he died. He couldn't help but wonder if this was anything like Danzu's own life, which had started strong, gotten weaker, and ended with him being little more than a guide. If the old Warhawk gave the cage advice, would he just be another point of view for Mai to think about as she ran the empire he built? In that case, he would have to start giving Mai more power and get her ready to take over completely as he slowly faded away, never to be seen again. It seemed to be his fate to lose everything. In this case, though, what he lost might not be gone for good. He could still look at it with love as it grew bigger and changed to fit the world he had brought it into. He thought it would be better than to lose it all. At the very least, the success of what he had made would make sure that his pride would never be hurt. He realized that his pride, which was one of his biggest flaws, was the only thing he could count on to stay with him until the end. With the help of the flock and dogs of Konoha and the support of a daimyo, his wolves would continue to grow and take over. It would keep going forever. Not with him. But he would carry the pride of making it with him until the end of his life. Every victory it won was a victory for himself. He was sure it would make him angry, but at least his wolves would be taken care of. And wasn't that all that mattered in the end? He shook the idea out of his head for a while. He would have 2 weeks to think about this, so there wasn't much point in doing so as he stood near the carriage that would take him to one of the 5 larger capitals. On this trip, he would have 10 wolves with him. 2 wolves would drive the carriage, 2 wolves would ride on the back of the carriage, and 3 wolves would stand on either side of the carriage. They stood apart from everyone else. They carried their belongings in scrolls and were ready to give everything they had to their lord. Even less people were in the other group. Hannah and Sai stood next to each other, with 2 wolves on either side of them. That was the end. The unofficial lord of Nami no Kuni would never leave in front of a crowd, and he would never come back to one either. As far as his people were concerned, Inuzuka Hannah led them, and everything good that happened would always be credited to her and the wolves she worked with. He didn't have anything to do with these people or this land, but it was his and he would take care of it. As he got into the carriage, there were no cheers, waves, or well wishes from the crowds or villagers. No, he didn't say a word as he got into the wooden carriage and closed the door behind him. His group of wolves then took positions on and around the carriage. As he looked out the window, the world began to move slowly by. This was the first step on his way to disappearing. Under his leadership, the wolves would become legendary, a part of history so great that it would never be forgotten, but he wasn't a wolf, so people would soon forget about him. But it was all right. Even after he died, the wolves would keep going, and through his child, he would live on forever. Even if everyone forgot about him, he would always be the one who started everything. He would always be known as the wolf's father. She thought that the mood was too gloomy, as if he were going to be put to death instead of being recognized as a lord by one of the 5 greater daimyo. The wolves were too professional to cheer, but the silence didn't feel right either. Then there was the lack of, well, everyone. Even though the man across from her had helped the whole village, no one was there. Even her presence usually meant that someone from the village was nearby, but the gathering of wolves was apparently enough to keep them from looking into what was going on. She gave the thought a light frown. It wasn't fair that the people of Nami no Kuni praised her for what she had done and would trust her more than the group that had freed them. But she never heard any of the wolves complain about it. They seemed to just accept it and keep going. That, or maybe they just didn't care and only cared about what their leader said. He was their leader. The Inuzuka clan was known for being loyal, but the wolves' loyalty to Tsukiyomi was much stronger. The Inuzuka would always be there for each other, and the wolves would do anything for Tsukiyomi. Usually, she would say that's a bad thing, but Tsukiyomi didn't seem to want to take advantage of it, even though other people might have. In fact, he seemed to care more about what his army needed than what he needed. It was a good thing to do, especially for someone so young, but something about the whole thing felt so wrong. For one thing, the look in his eyes didn't seem right for a man who was going to talk to a daimyo about the future of his country. Instead of the excitement, calm, or even panic that she would expect from the average person, he just seemed to be lost in thought, but there was something about him that made her feel like he was giving up. Wasn't this a good thing? Why did she think he was about to make his fate certain? It was, to say the least, an uncomfortable feeling, and she didn't like it at all. In the week that she had been here, Tsukiyomi had shown that he was a good leader whose people liked him. No, that wasn't quite the right word for his wolves. They weren't followers, they were a pack, his pack. And his pack, which was like his family, looked up to him the way she had always looked up to her mother. He was more than just their leader, he was also their parent and their father. No matter how old they were, they all looked up to him for help and acceptance. Even though she had only been here a week, she was starting to think of him as the father she had only met briefly before. But parents did sometimes give up things for their kids, didn't they? Was that why he seemed so resigned to a fate she couldn't even guess? What did he have in mind, and how did he keep it from even his most loyal followers? She was just hoping that whatever it was didn't hurt him too much. If he were to die, his pack would be very sad, and she didn't think it could go on without him. Aside from Tsukiyomi's will, they had no reason to protect Wave or join forces with her clan. If something bad happened, she would lose Wave, her clan would lose their best friend, Nami no Kuni would lose the people who freed and protected it, and the wolves would no longer have a reason to exist. Without him, everything would fall apart. He must have known this, right? He couldn't keep going with something that could hurt the pack that he had worked so hard to give a place in the world. And yet she couldn't shake the sight of his eyes from her mind even as he entered into his carriage and started towards the capital. Something was troubling him deeply, something she probably couldn't hope to fully understand, but whatever it was he had accepted it, for good or ill. They would just have to trust him and his judgment, for this was his pack and now she was involved with it. As soon as the Inuzuka had joined with the wolves, their packs had become one and the same in the eyes of the heiress. Her mother was the alpha. Tsukiyomi was the alpha. My, that odd young woman, was somewhere between the two, not quite their equal but also not quite below them to the level that she and Sai were. Together they were the head of this new pack. Mother, father, heiress, commander, and the strange girl who seemed to have somehow caught the eye of both parents. Together they were a family. Together they were a pack. Together they were strong. But without Tsukiyomi, they would all fall apart. She hoped that whatever it was that bothered him would be resolved soon and leave him at peace. They needed him, she needed him. The young heiress that had never before found herself wanting a father had ended up finding one after having only known the man for a week, and for the first time in years her family felt complete. She wasn't about to lose him now. Not after having just found him. He was the father of the wolves, her father perhaps even for real one day in the future, and she'd be damned if he went through whatever it was that bothered him so alone when she was here and able to support him. And support him she would, with everything she had. The father of the wolves deserved no less. Another bump in the road rocked the transport, but it wasn't anything its lone occupant hadn't grown accustomed to. At first they had found it to be a rather odd feeling, being thrown about constantly on the ruined roads of a suspiciously poor country, but as time passed and the roads increased in both quality and wear, they had come quite used to the odd feeling of weightlessness that so often accompanied the bumps that grew to be less and less frequent. Of course, this did not stop the various bumps from constantly interrupting his thoughts, and trying to anticipate the next did more harm than good, for it was impossible for him to predict the road in all its many small imperfections when he had never before laid eyes on it. And, while it may have been tempting to draw away the blinds of the carriage's single window and simply watch the world roll by, it was ill-advised. The less people could see of him the better chance he had of getting to his destination alive. Not that he knew of anyone specific currently out for his life, but it was always better to be safe, something his guards understood quite clearly. It's why they had begged him to refrain, after all. As much as he'd like to ignore them for the sake of ending the sheer boredom that plagued him, he knew they were right, and if keeping himself in the shadows helped ease their worries even a fraction, he would gladly never again see the light of day. Hey, the shadows. It was almost funny how often his thoughts drifted along this exact path. Then again, perhaps not. The wolves were his pride and joy, a family that he had made for himself that would never turn on him. He loved his pack, wanted nothing but the best for them, but in order to do that he had to split his focus dangerously so. The wolves were pretty self-sufficient even now. Any distraction on his part would have a negligible effect on their well-being, something he was certain Sai would be able to more than make up for, or something he would have been, had the wolves been as stable as he'd like. It wasn't like they were in danger of falling apart, but rather quite the opposite. They were still growing, and rapidly at that. One might even beg the thought that they were growing too fast for their own good, and while he wasn't completely sure of the truth of that statement, he was sure that it was growing too fast for him. Despite having left most of it in the hands of Mai and Sai in preparation of his shinobi career with Konohagakure no Sato, he was still heavily involved then, and with his career taking such a drastic setback, though perhaps also an incredible boon, if not for him then for the wolves, but likely for them both, he had only been able to throw himself further into the welfare of his pack. Now, however, he received mostly vague reports and the occasional detail that needed his final say. Even being in the country he had just taken over, he received little more than status reports, while the inside workings were taken care of by Sai and a slowly growing administrative staff, half of which would probably find themselves reassigned to help him, though mostly Inuzuka Hana as Nami no Kuni was governed. There was simply too much for one person to ever hope to handle alone, and only a fool would attempt it.
A fool or Danzo. Danzo did have some advantages that he didn't have. For one thing, even though Danzo worked all over the world, it did so on a much smaller scale. The fact that the man got so much done with such a small group shows how skilled he was. Well, small wasn't the best word for root, but it wasn't very big either. For lack of a better word, it was a good size. You could even say it was just right for Danzo's needs.
Danzo would have liked to have a lot more operatives, but the way he did things, he had to have things a certain way and wouldn't accept them any other way, meant he missed out on a lot of possible operatives. He was pretty happy about that, because he wouldn't have his own little army if Danzo didn't want all of his forces to be perfectly trained, which didn't happen very often because not everyone could be trained or could work afterward. He should send the man a gift, like a nice bottle of wine, just for that. On second thought, the man might be too paranoid for something like that, which would be a waste of good wine. Maybe something like a pen. No, that would be too easy to hide explosive notes in. The man wouldn't take a chance on it without a careful look, and even then, he probably wouldn't keep it. Danzo, on the other hand, was sure to have enemies. He'd have to put that idea on the back burner. Danzo was not the kind of person who would be easy to shop for. He was more likely to find something if he just went to the market and looked around than if he thought about it, because the more he thought about it, the easier it was to find ways that the gift could hurt him. He would become as crazy as the old hawk if he didn't stop soon. Not that paranoia was a bad thing, especially in this profession, but he really didn't feel like being as paranoid as the leader of Root, at least not this early in his life. People could say that being paranoid would let him live to an age where he thought it was okay to be paranoid, but he would much rather enjoy those years. Where did he go? Ah, yes. Back to the good things about Danzo. Not only did they have less people than he did, but each operation was also smaller. He couldn't put his operatives in danger, and most of the time he couldn't send help if something went wrong. In order to do this, things had to be easy and clear, or else a big problem could ruin all of his plans. Since Danzo didn't really make small plans, it was just a matter of a lot of small, short-term missions that could be easily changed to take into account things that couldn't be planned for. The man owed most of his success to this method, and he didn't think the retired veteran would change such a good system anytime soon.
On that note, the fact that Danzo was retired was another big plus. Danzo was still an unofficial advisor and had a seat on the council, but he didn't know why. It could have been a clan seat, but it was probably for something else. It could have been for his services, his experiences, or even by the Imperial Fire Court for some reason he didn't know about. He had a lot of time to do the careful micromanaging and mission analysis he did to make sure his organization kept running smoothly.
Even though the work was boring, it did wonders for Root's productivity and gave him a view of his operations that not many other leaders could hope to have. It was pretty impressive, to be honest. Even though it wasn't something he was very interested in, it was still pretty cool. No, he didn't need to be that involved, even though he would have liked to do more. In fact, he would have liked to work on the field with his wolves. A good middle ground would have been better. Not only did he have more to worry about than Danzo, but he also had 2 more groups that he was trying to move to his advantage. At the moment, the Hyuga don't know that he has power over them, but he has to be very careful with them. He didn't do anything because he didn't need to use them right now and because he had to be so damn careful about how he and his wolves might interact with them in even the smallest way.
He would never deal with another cult again unless they were after him.
Ever. Even though they were loyal and devoted, it was just too much trouble to be worth it. If Hinata wasn't leading them and he hadn't put her there in a roundabout way, he wouldn't have touched it. Or, since he was inexperienced, he would have touched it and then quickly washed his hands of the matter.
Figureheads like Sai worked fine, especially since the wolves already knew who was really in charge, but cult leaders were a bit much. That had nothing to do with where his little goddess was at the time. Either the cult or the clan would have been enough trouble on their own, but they couldn't stay apart, could they? Of course not. He had to deal with the fact that they were so intertwined backwards that one wrong move could easily start the Fourth Shinobi World War.
That was a little out there, but he would probably say he was channeling his inner Danzo if you asked him about it. If you had seen Kumokagure no Sato, you might say that both of them were channeling their inner Omoi, but thank goodness neither of them went as far as that young swordsman did. Something that would make those who knew the swordsman very grateful and not a little bit jealous. Since the groups were spread out, it was unlikely that they would ever run into each other. At a personal level, at least. Even though the 2 villages lived in an uneasy peace, there was still a lot of bad blood between them. Even if they ran into each other, the chances of them talking to each other in any way other than taunts, insults, and maybe a few threats were incredibly low. If Omoi's teammate Samui was there, the list would grow to include flirting, hints, and crude sexual comments about her breast size. If their friend Yugito was there, a lot of double meanings could be expected. In either case, it was almost certain that pain screams and sad male whimpering would follow quickly. And maybe the end of some family lines. So, Omoi's inner self aside, if he wasn't careful with the cult in the clan from which it grew, he could very well start a world war, and it could happen as soon as a few weeks from now. Problems between the main and branch families had been going on for as long as anyone could remember, and the clan was now the biggest and most powerful, at least in terms of manpower. The Senju and Uzumaki still had more political power, even though they were not as strong as they used to be. If a civil war broke out, Konoha would be in danger. Even if that wasn't enough to make old enemies want to attack the village that had just lost the famous Uchiha clan, any fight between the Hyuga clan would make the village try to step in. And even if they were able to stop the branch family or even get rid of the main family to have more control over the clan, it was just as likely that Konoha would be pulled into a civil war. He felt a little pain at the thought. Even though he avoided it, his actions against the Yamanaka almost caused a civil war. He almost did it again when Kushina used his decision to go into self-imposed exile as an excuse to go against the clan of Mindwalkers. If some of the clans had stood up to her, he was sure that things would have turned violent quickly. It wouldn't have mattered in the end, and he wouldn't be trying to avoid it now, because it would have already started the Fourth Shinobi War. In fact, they might have been fighting there right now, but it's more likely that the battle is over and the winners are now fighting over the biggest pieces of what used to be the first hidden village. He loved Konoha because it was his home, but he could see that they were getting weaker. Standards were dropping, fewer people were joining the shinobi forces, which was probably why standards were falling. People were getting fat, lazy, and complacent, and Sarutobi Hiruzen, who was an amazing leader and shinobi, was well past his prime and it showed. It hurts a lot. He still had respect for the man because of what he had done and what he had been through, but he shouldn't be leading them right now, even though it was peacetime. Iwa was always trying to rip out their throats with shinobi who were almost as stubborn as the Uzumaki clan, which is almost extinct, and had the drive to keep going no matter what. Even when the Yondaime Hokage was cutting through them like a hurricane through rice paper, they didn't stop and kept charging until the last man fell. It was brave, very dumb, but most of all, it was dangerous. Very dangerous. One had to respect an enemy who wouldn't give up even when the odds were against them, who would give up their life for their country and the smallest chance of killing their enemy. It wasn't very ninja-like, but these days there aren't that many things that are. Like most shinobi today, they were warriors, but they were more like thieves than samurai. No, that wasn't a good comparison. They had the energy and wildness of bandits, but they were much more dangerous than that. Comparing them to such common trash was an insult to their skill and determination. Iwa and its children were like barbarians, tribes of warriors who didn't care about their own wounds as long as their enemies' rotting bodies fed the murder of crows that watched battlefields with the eyes of death. Even after all these years and all the treaties that had been made to prevent another shinobi world war, Iwa was not someone to take lightly as an enemy. There was no doubt that Iwa only cared about the same treaties if one of their enemies stopped following them. This didn't help them in any way, but it did give them a chance to be less secretive and do more of what they were already doing without worrying about being blamed. Even when there was peace, the Iwa kept their weapons in good shape, and they were always eager to get their pride back for the sake of their warriors who died fighting Namikaze Minato. He couldn't really blame them, though. Kumo was, in ways, similar to Iwa. They were always ready for war, just like those who hid in the stones. They could do better than them. Iwa would send generation after generation to attack their enemies' gates, but they could only make the land around their village red. Every generation would get stronger, meaner, and more willing to die for the chance to get revenge for their dead fathers. When the gate finally fell, they would rush through the enemy village like a pack of hungry animals. Kumo would walk up to a gate in a line. There wouldn't be a gate for them to walk out of. When I thought of Iwa, the word savagery came to mind, but Kumo was definitely a pro. Their army wasn't as big as I was, but each shinobi was trained to a level that was much higher than I was. Kumo was a military, and war was its life. It didn't care whether it was fighting for one, getting ready for one, or getting over one. Kumo lived, ate, and slept war. When the trumpets went off, they were the first dogs to run out of their village and tear through their enemies. With Kumo, there was a sense that no movement was wasted, which was to be expected from a village where the sword was almost as popular as the infamous Bloody Mist. Iwa would try until they were successful, but Kumo wouldn't try until it was clear that they would win. It was hard to tell which of the two was the bigger threat, because they were both dangerous on the battlefield. Obviously, if one of them was fighting with the other would soon join in. It wasn't a surprise, since Konoha had been thought to be the best for a long time, even though the other two had much more power than Konoha could currently hope to gather. They didn't want to miss the chance to take down the first hidden village and move to the top of the new food chain. They also knew that if one of the other villages took over most of Konoha, it was likely that they would be able to take over the other villages as well. Even though Konoha didn't have as many people as the other villages, it always had more resources than it needed. The other villages never forgot this. Hashirama made a good choice when he put Konoha where he did, and the village has been better off ever since. Even though the other villages were strong enough to defend themselves, they were too far away and had such tight security that they couldn't trade and had to live off of what they could make themselves. The fact that it could be defended meant that it wasn't much. Only Kirigakure was able to avoid this bad situation because it was close to the ocean and had plenty of seafood. His new country used to trade a lot with Kirigakure, but since the bloodline purges began, the village has shut itself off from the rest of the world. It's likely why Nami no Kuni was in such bad shape that Gado had to take over. Their economy would have been in shambles without that trade route. When it came to Kiri, Konoha was lucky that they were too busy with their own problems to do anything. However, there was always the chance that Kiri's problems would spread beyond Mizu no Kuni and pull the rest of the world into their mess. It may have been why there hadn't been any other fights. Kiri was closer to both Iwa and Kumo than it was to Konoha. This was often used by Iwa and Kumo as an excuse to have a lot more troops than the treaties allowed, and neither village wanted to be caught in the middle of a war on two fronts. On the other hand, the tension Kiri's problems caused could start a war, and that war could end before Kiri opened up to the world again. That would be very interesting, and he could only imagine how confused someone would feel if they found out they had missed a shinobi world war. Kirigakure was famous for its never-ending hunger for blood. They didn't care if they were killing strangers or their own people. All they wanted to do was shed blood. Between Iwa's wildness and Kumo's military skill, Kiri would have been the biggest threat to any of the villages if it hadn't been cut off from the rest of the world by its own fighting. If these three countries worked together, Konoha would be completely destroyed, and their only ally, Suna, wouldn't be able to help. Suna was barely a greater village. It was broke and didn't have many people interested in the path of the shinobi because there weren't enough missions for it to be a popular job. This was only possible because of how big Kei's no Kuni was and how much money their daimyo had made from the desert mines. Suna was just as likely to go against them as to help them, since their daimyo usually went to Konoha when he needed something. In Konoha, shinobi could be better trained, and there were more jobs than there were people to do them. In light of this, he wasn't sure why they still worked together. He couldn't see how it helped Konoha, unless it was just a precaution because of how close they were. They already had a tense peace with the rest of the world, and Suna wasn't friendly. Their shinobi were also pretty hostile for supposed allies, which wasn't surprising given their situation, so he didn't see what the point was unless Konoha was going to help, which they should have done a long time ago to strengthen their bonds and give them a reliable ally. On the other hand, it wasn't his job either. He wasn't the Hokage and wasn't one of the people who helped him make plans. Suna would just have to accept that they were still friends with him, for good or bad, and go about his own business. As part of their business, they had to be ready in case Suna did turn against them. They couldn't do much against the village itself because the sands of the desert were a good defense, but if they had an extra army, it would be devastating. By moving his troops north, he could trap any Suna army between his wolves and the shinobi of Konohagakure. This was just an added benefit of having most of them just outside of Hai no Kuni. He's thinking about how all these other villages are always getting ready for war, and he's doing the same thing with his new country. It seems like war was the only thing in the shinobi world. It didn't come as much a shock, but once again, he let his thoughts get away from him. The wolves were getting too big for him to control them directly every day. The cult in the Hyuga clan was just one of many situations that could lead to another world war, and he had a lot more to deal with. At the moment, and hopefully for a while longer, the only other group was the Inuzuka clan of Konohagakure. The Inuzuka is a blessing from the gods. He didn't run the Inuzuka like he did the other two groups, and they could do everything on their own. He couldn't talk to them for a year, and they'd be fine, because they were fine before he tried to talk to them. They were a clan in Konoha with a low but stable position that wasn't going to change without a lot of work. Or some assistance. That's where he and the wolves came in, of course. They helped the Inuzuka, and the Inuzuka promised to look out for their best interests in Konoha. He didn't have to worry about the Inuzuka turning against him anytime soon because the heiress was now working with the wolves in a position that gave her almost full control of a profitable country and made it easy for her to support her clan with the money from that country. He did have to pay attention to the information they sent him and reply quickly enough for them to act on it. He didn't need them to do much right now, and letting them benefit from the partnership was sure to make them happy. However, unlike with the Hyuga, where it was dangerous to move, he didn't need the Inuzuka right away. Some of them were in Nami no Kuni, where the heiress was getting ready to run the country, publicly, of course. He was sure he'd have to do most of the work behind the scenes to keep things running smoothly. And those who were still in Konoha knew who their new partners were. He could probably put some wolves in their compound for security or to train some of their members, but he would wait to do that for now. He wouldn't mind, though, if Ninken had a few wolves or even just a few trained dogs with him. That would be good in every way. In fact, the sooner they started, the better. He would have to let Mai know and see if she couldn't set something up. He quickly wrote down the idea in the notebook that was open on the seat next to him so he wouldn't forget. Even though he probably wouldn't forget because the thought would be running through his head until something else came along to replace it and there wasn't much going on around him to distract him, it was better to be safe than sorry. Because of this, he hadn't brought any of Gado's files with him to look over during the trip. After 3 days, he started to wonder if the risk wasn't worth it in the end. He didn't even need to think about it because he already knew that taking such a risk wasn't worth it, but it would have given him something to do. He wondered idly if there were any books in Gado's house, which was probably the case, and he kicked himself for not grabbing a few for the trip. Even though the trip gave him a lot of time to think about his wolves, he really could have used a break. You could only think about what was going on with the different groups you were a part of so many times before you started to worry about what could go wrong. On his way to see a daimyo, he should have tried to stay away from worrying about what could go wrong. Because he was very nervous, even though he didn't show it and his wolves wouldn't notice. This wasn't someone he could have killed or blackmail right away. Threats wouldn't work, the legal system wouldn't help against its own ultimate authority, and the Greater Lord samurai armies were nothing to laugh at. If he didn't do this right, he could lose Wave when the other villages sent their own forces to take over. They wouldn't tell anyone, of course, and would probably use a third party to take over and run everything. However, that group would have the support of the village or even a rival lord who wanted it, which was something he couldn't say he had yet. Even though he knew that any daimyo would jump at the chance to benefit from Nami no Kuni in a way that other countries couldn't object to, there was always that nagging doubt.
All that was needed for everything to go wrong was for a distant relative of the Yamanaka to take control of the court or for a daimyo to be stopped from making a decision by a person who didn't trust him. Even if the Greater Lord had a cold and didn't want to deal with his wolves, that would be enough to cause them a lot of trouble.
They could go to another lord, but word spread quickly, and if one lord turned them down, the next would probably do the same out of principle. All of them were competitive jerks, and if one of them said the arrangement wasn't good enough, no Greater Lord with any pride would accept them because it would make him look like he had lower standards than his peers. This really was a once-in-a-lifetime chance, because everyone else who wanted a piece of Nami no Kuni and its better trade location would have left them alone. That doesn't mean they were counting on the support of a Greater Lord, though. He had also thought of other ways to protect his position in case something went wrong. Even though it wasn't ideal and wouldn't be as easy, it was still possible to do these things if the Greater Lord didn't want to play Nami no Kuni. But, as we've already said, the best choice was the Greater Lord. There was probably more than one country that didn't like his plan to take over smaller countries by force until he had as much land as the bigger lords and could stand up to them. No, he would definitely try to avoid doing that. Unless they were able to get help from a more powerful lord, as he had planned. If that happened, he wouldn't have to worry too much about the next wave, and each country would help him get more help from his benefactor and make the other big countries less likely to go against them. It was just a matter of convincing the Greater Lord that it was a good idea. He sighed and leaned all the way back in his seat, letting his head fall back. Even if the roads were good, it was hard to sleep in the carriage because of how it was set up. It was fine for short trips, though. The Lord knew that the man would do it. The Greater Lord wasn't stupid, but he also wasn't very careful. He was a happy, if vain, man who would jump at the chance to gain more power, even if it was just to show off to his peers. He just needed to take things easy, and everything would be fine. It was easier to say than to do, though, and the thought that he might fail kept going through his head, making him think of all the different things he might have to deal with soon. He weighed his own plans against each other and came up with something he could work with, but that didn't make him feel any better. If he thought everything was taken care of, what was he missing? 2 weeks of worrying about this meeting and what would happen to his kids, the wolves, had worn him down. He had already lost his family, so he wouldn't do it again. If that meant he had to give them the whole world to keep them safe, he would work until the day his body gave out to make sure they would last until the end of time. This would be a legacy that would keep him alive forever. Even if the wolves forgot who he was in the far future, he would always be known as their creator, and as long as the wolves were known until the end of time, he would never be forgotten again. If this stress were just a taste of what he would have to pay in the end, he would gladly carry the load. But a massage from Mai would be much appreciated. Some snakes liked living in places that were wet. One of them was not Yakushi Kabuto. He was very lucky to be stationed in Hai no Kuni, a country full of dry forests. It was a lot better than working in a place like rice paddies, where rice was grown in field after field. There were many ways to avoid them, but that didn't make him like the country anymore. No, he liked things to be nice and dry and, if possible, a little bit warm. He didn't care about the heat or the cold, though, as long as it was dry. Working on tricky medical experiments and having your notes get wet in the middle of them was the best. Orochimaru's bases were always kept dry and cold, which was good for what they were used for, but Kabuto, who was a spy, didn't like tight tunnels very much. In some cases, they did make people feel safe, but Kabuto had trained to be able to hide in plain sight, which could be more dangerous than anything that could threaten one of the many buildings where the hidden sound shinobi lived. Since there were no walls or other obstacles, there were an infinite number of ways to get out if something went wrong. And because of that, he liked to spend his free time outside their secret bases, which was bad. Places like Mizu no Kuni and Yuki no Kuni were just too wet for him to enjoy himself. This made it harder for him to do his master's or mistress's work and made him more likely to fail. Work. Now he could add Nami no Kuni to that list. His eyes looked around him with distaste, and he could hear footsteps behind him as a small group of Auto shinobi marched toward the new country of Orochimaru's godson. Godson, that was a shocker. He would never have guessed that Orochimaru was the child's godfather, let alone that the child thought well of him. Still, that kid just took control of a country. They might have been a better match than he was comfortable with. Even he would agree that one Orochimaru was not the best thing for the world, but two was a scary thought that made him want to pray to anyone who could hear him so that it wouldn't happen. Having a godson who helped her or him. He tried not to think about it because it didn't make him feel good about the situation, but it was better than two of them. Don't get me wrong, Orochimaru was very smart, but the world could hardly handle him alone. Kabuto liked the world a lot. He did live here, after all. We hope for a very, very long time. He knew that the only thing they had in common was that they had both taken over a country, so he hoped that this Naruto was just a kind godson who wanted to help out his godmother. Orochimaru had said something about Tsunade when talking about the boy, so Kabuto had to wonder if the boy knew he had a second godmother or if this would all be a surprise to him. As was just said, he had, of course, taken over a country, so maybe not too shocking. The thought of how he might react, on the other hand, gave the spy something to think about other than the awful wetness all around him. As thick white mist swirled on the road in front of him and danced in tendrils between the trees on either side of him, he cursed again that he had been given this job. He couldn't think of a single reason why the job couldn't have been given to one of the Sound Four, or all of them, or even Gurren, who was about the same rank as him. She should have been here right now, but she wasn't. They had about the same skill and rank, and the only real difference was that he was supposed to be keeping his cover over in Konohagakure no Sato right now. He didn't have a low-level job that would have made it easy for him to leave. Instead, he had worked his way up to become a top doctor and was the son of the hospital's director. When he left, people noticed, and it wouldn't be long before suspicions grew. Why did the doctor have to leave the country so quickly, anyway? Leaving had been hard enough, considering how busy the hospital was all the time, but when he went back, the questions would start, and he wouldn't be able to leave again for many, many months. He was sure that this would hurt his network. He didn't think Orochimaru cared much, but he thought the snake summoner cared a lot more about Gurren's crystal than Kabuto's spy network. He was probably right, since the previous plans to attack Konoha were scrapped out of fear that it would upset Orochimaru's godson. He wouldn't be surprised if the only reason she hadn't asked him to bring it down was that she could use it to keep an eye on her godson and get updates on how he was doing. He found it much harder to understand why she would care about that than her recent gender change. Or did that mean she turned into a man? His gender changed, and now Orochimaru was a woman. He didn't care because it wasn't important enough. He would be fine as long as he didn't have to start calling her mistress. With all of her dungeons and her tendency to sexually and otherwise torture captives when she was angry, the most overqualified lab assistant in the elemental nations didn't like the idea of being called that. The show, Orochimaru-sama, should do fine. Thank God he could call them that no matter what they were. Unless, of course, she chose to change her name. He got a chill when he thought about it, as if the world wasn't strange enough. He shook the thought out of his mind and turned his attention back to the bridge and the guards standing in front of it. As the snarling faces of the wolves became clearer, he swallowed nervously and ran his hand lightly over the letter he kept in his shirt. People said that the last person in charge of Wave had hired Momochi Zabuza. No one knew for sure what had happened, but Kabuto's motto as a spy was to be safe rather than sorry. So what if it was just a big group that got Zabuza to leave because they were so many and none of them were stronger than bandits? It was much safer to treat them with respect than to risk upsetting a group where every member was stronger than the A-ranked missing nin. If he hadn't been representing Orochimaru and if the woman of gods, that was still Weirda hadn't made it clear that the mission couldn't fail or she'd lose contact with her godson and take out her anger on him, he might have thought about changing his mind when he found out how strong their allies really were. It was also strange that they now had friends. They had worked together in the past, but most of the time it was just so Orochimaru could turn on them or use them in some way to get what she wanted. But to have real allies with whom they were expected to work together and most of the time give way, that had never happened before. Of course, that made it interesting, too, and Kabuto hated being bored more than anything. A little bit of change would have been better than what he had now. He could have done without that change. When they got to Nami no Kuni's only bridge, he was only half paying attention because he was thinking about how nice the weather had been back in Konoha. When he stopped a safe distance from the guards, he looked around again and made sure his hands were out in the open as the wolf-faced guards got closer to his group. As they got closer, he caught glimpses of white porcelain through the trees. These were probably guards keeping an eye on them, so it didn't surprise him when he saw them step out from behind his group. If nothing else, this group seemed professional, which was a nice change from the usual bandits and warlords he had to deal with for Orochimaru. They seemed as skilled as Konoha's Anbu, the only shinobi he thought really deserved to be called shinobi. Even though they hadn't found him yet, he thought a lot of that group. He had been a sleeper agent and spy since he was a very young child. Most people didn't even know that he had been found outside of Konoha and taken in by a Konoha doctor. Orochimaru was so smart that he could do anything. In the name of Tsukiyomi, please tell me who you are. Tsukiyomi. Either Orochimaru's godson wasn't at the top or he put someone else in charge of his new country. Well, he might have been hiding his identity, which was something Kabuto had to respect as a spy. Actually, now that he thinks about it, if that was true, the two of them might be more alike than he thought before. Both of them were from Konoha, and while they were dealing with the famous S-ranked traitor Orochimaru of the Sannin, they didn't let anyone know who they really were. Few, if any, other people could say the same thing. Though, the kid was ahead of him because Kabuto had never tried to take over a country. Still, it didn't sound like a bad idea, so maybe he'd do it someday. I'm Yakushi Kabuto, and I'm here at Orochimaru's request. I brought shinobi from Otogakure no Sado with me to start setting up an outpost, as Naruto, Orochimaru's godson, invited us to do. Hidden base just didn't seem like the right word to use in this situation, he thought. Even as he was talking, it looked like the wolves were getting ready to attack. They were definitely on edge when Naruto's name was used. If someone used his name without permission, it was clear they wouldn't be sorry. Just a letter from Young to Orochimaru-sama, as growls, real growls, appeared from behind some of the masks. When he realized that the boy might find his address insulting, he quickly added to it, Master Naruto, as was given to him by a child of Ao who was called by him in his role as High Priest to the Golden Serpent. The person who was asking him questions seemed confused by some of the information he gave. They didn't seem to know everything about Orochimaru's godson, but they didn't seem surprised that he was stronger than they thought. Kabuto was impressed by how loyal they were. Even Orochimaru couldn't get anyone else to be as loyal as Kagaya was. To be fair, Orochimaru did prefer to rule through fear, and it did suit her. Show me the letter, the wolf said in the end, putting out his hand in anticipation. Slowly, so slowly that it almost hurt, Kabuto put one hand into his top and grabbed the letter. Orochimaru only gave it up reluctantly for this reason, and he knew that if anything happened to it, his life would be over, since she cared a lot about it. Another strange thing about her was that she seemed to be obsessed with something. Making a show of turning the parchment this way and that to show there was nothing hidden on it, he slowly moved closer and put it in the waiting hand before taking a step and a half back. The note was short, and he was allowed to read it himself, so it didn't take the man long to read it. Even so, Kabuto could feel the frown pulling down on his lips, which were hidden by his mask. He gave the letter to Kabuto and said, I see. Kabuto quickly, but very carefully, took the letter and put it back on his top. That looks like it was done by Tsukiyomi, but I'll have to check with the commander since he's not here. So, that proved that the name theory was right. But the absence was a little bit strange. Orochimaru had planned to come in a few days to meet her godson. She was going to be very upset. He would have to remember to let her know about his absence and the name he used while he was with the wolves soon if he didn't want her to take out her anger on one of her subordinates, like him. Of course. Orochimaru-sama made it clear that Wave belongs to the wolves, and that until they arrived, we should listen to you. When he said, Orochimaru is coming here, there was obvious discomfort, which made sense. There weren't many S-ranked shinobi, and only one of them was a real danger. That was the plan. But you said Tsukiyomi-sama wasn't there. Orochimaru-sama was very eager to meet their godchild, but since he's not there, I think the meeting will have to be put off. Very well. I'll tell the commander so that Tsukiyomi-sama can be told. Until then, though, I'll have to ask you to stay here so we can figure out what's going on. I hope that's not a problem. The wolf didn't care, but at least he was being polite. At least that was something. Not at all. Please take your time. We'll be here. No, he'd rather they didn't take their time, but if one of the wolves so much as whispered that he had been rude during Orochimaru's inevitable, but soon to be delayed, visit, he wouldn't be shedding skin. It would be ripped from his skin. From the way the wolf spoke, it was clear that the man was laughing, and the way some of his friends' shoulders moved up and down showed that he wasn't the only one. Don't worry, we're going to do it. Kabuto just about stopped himself from letting out a sigh of defeat. It looked like it would be a long day. Damn you, Gurren, and your bloodline. I want to go back to Konoha. Do you understand what I told you to do? 3 answers of "hi" came back at the same time from the dark room, where 6 eyes were looking back at him. This wasn't like him. He was going into new territory that was off limits, and one wrong step could be disastrous. But he had to do it because he had to find out what the boy was doing. Remember, if they find you, they'll be angry with us, and if she finds out what I've sent you to do, she'll be angry with us too. If you fail, we won't help you. From the moment you leave this room until you report success, we'll think you're a traitor to the clan, and if Konoha finds out you're missing, you'll be hunted as a missing nin. His daughter did well by making friends with the heiress. Without the news she brought back from her mission, he would have had no idea what they were doing. He wasn't sure that those things were wrong, but he was sure that they were a possible threat that needed to be looked into. Even more important was the fact that he and his family had a history with the group. He said he was done with their clan, that he had made his point, and that he was giving up his project to avoid a pointless fight, but then someone else got involved in his life. Still, he got what he wanted and did what he set out to do, so everything else was just a bonus. But that didn't mean he couldn't bring them down, whether he meant to or not. Since he didn't care much or at all about the clan, they were just as likely to be killed by accident as they were to be his target. He didn't need them anymore, so what did it matter if they disappeared? They were under the protection and control of another clan, and he didn't care if that clan couldn't give them the right protection. Not for the first time, he cursed the woman who had taken his clan from him because others were afraid of the political consequences of going against the old clan. He had to agree that her plan to ask the Imperial Fire Court for advice was clever and well done. No one knew who she had asked, and while Inoichi was pretty sure she had only talked to one member of the court, the other clans were understandably worried that the whole court or at least a large part of it had looked into the matter and agreed with her. They knew it was a bad idea to go up against someone with that much power, so they sided with her. This meant that old allies turned their backs on her to protect themselves. It didn't help her in the end, though. The whole reason she did it was weak and poorly planned, or maybe it was just a bad idea. It was planned well enough to get her what she wanted, but getting it didn't help her reach her other goals. Instead, it made her son even less likely to come back, which was the last thing she wanted. He sort of cared about the woman. He would do anything for his daughter, even if this whole mess could be blamed on her, even if the boy was partly to blame for his actions. She showed that she was willing to do anything to get her son back when she tried to find him. The biggest problem was that she was so focused on carrying out the plans that she stopped trying to figure out what he wanted. He didn't know if the boy wanted anything that the woman could give. Hell, his daughter's friend told him that the wolves, who he knew were led by the boy, had just taken over a country. A hell of a country. He couldn't think of anything that would make her like the boy, unless she was going to give him an army of slaves, which seemed pretty likely, or another country, which he probably didn't need help with, since he seemed pretty capable. And really, giving people money wasn't the best way to do this. If she wanted things to get better, she would have to talk to the boy. Even though he made things hard for Hera and for most people, because he was so private, he wasn't trying to avoid her. He thought she knew where he lived based on what he had heard. Even though he is on vacation right now, as something that not many genin could do because of their team and the low pay of the missions they did, he would be back at some point. She just needed a place to sleep, and she didn't spend much time at her own place anyway. Almost all of her time was spent running 2 clans, and she only went home to take quick showers and sleep for a few hours. She might feel closer to him if she did it at his house, and if he was really lucky, she would calm down and stop making his job harder. She might be in charge of his clan, but he was still the clan leader and had to keep everything running smoothly while she stood in the background, looming over his shoulder, and looked at every little thing. It was very, very tiring, but at least she got the bad end of the deal. She had to go over things for the Uzumaki clan after she was done with his clan's business. She messed up the kids' plans, so it's her fault. If they had made it, Yamanaka would be back on its feet and run by him alone. He would do his best to make sure his actions didn't hurt the boy, and when he could, he would help him. In exchange, he was sure that the wolves who had brought his clan down would protect his clan. After all, a clan was a very helpful thing to have in a hidden village, especially if you were trying to keep a group secret. Also, he should keep an eye out to find out who the wolves bit. The kid had plans for his clan, but he didn't seem upset when they fell through, which means he didn't have any trouble adapting. One of the clans was working with the wolves, as it should have been, so he should try his best to win their favor. If he was really lucky, he might even be able to get her to officially join their side. Now, wouldn't that be an interesting way for all of them to be linked? Even if he told her about his plans, he might be able to get her to agree that it would be a good way to start getting to know her son. Even though it wasn't the kind of relationship she wanted with him, it would be a start, which is something she still couldn't do. He would have to think for a while about whether or not it was worth it to show his hand and his plans to work in secret with whoever was working for the wolves here in Konoha. He could ask their daughters what they thought about it first. It was almost funny that, without his 2 best friends, who were the leaders of 2 clans that had been allies with his clan for a long time before they left him, he was now asking 2 12-year-old girls who had just become genin for advice. Unfortunately, they knew the boy best and were some of the only people in the village who knew what was going on with the wolves. The rest of the village, at least for now, was blissfully unaware. It was better than having no one to talk to, though, because he needed someone to bounce ideas off of, and his wife didn't care much about politics as long as she could take care of her gardens. Many times, he wished he could just quit being the clan leader and join her. He really couldn't wait to retire. He just hoped that he, his family, and their clan would live long enough for him to do so. If you fail and we don't get our freedom back, the clan will never know what you're about to do for them, he said, looking at the 3 people in front of him. He didn't see the boy and his wolves coming, so he couldn't defend his clan. But he wasn't going to stand by and let other players in the game tear them apart. No, they wouldn't stand still. Instead, they would move like water, like thoughts, and put themselves in a place where they could weather this storm. He wasn't the best at what he was doing, but he wasn't stupid either. He knew what needed to be done and how far he'd have to go for his clan. Because if he wasn't willing to put his clan at risk, he probably wouldn't have one when everything was over. But even so, know that you are all heroes, and I, if no one else, will remember what you were willing to sacrifice for the sake of your family. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Then, he quickly opened them again and gave the final order that would set things in motion forever. Go. For the sake of the clan and as quickly as the fastest spirits can. Hi, Inoichi-sama. Yamanaka Inoichi was left alone in the room after 3 shadows left. 3 spies were on their way to do a job for their clan. From the point of view of the village, 3 shinobi had turned against them. 3 men were about to put their lives in danger by sneaking into a country where wolves were in charge. He could only hope that everyone would get home safely. But they weren't known for being kind. He had to work very hard to keep a half smile on his face as he followed the wolf, who was leading his group. They had to wait for 4 fucked up hours. They could have fixed everything in a few minutes, but they had to stand outside for hours in Nami no Kuni's very humid air. What made it worse was that the wolves left as the guards laughed at them most of the time, clearly enjoying their pain. Mean-spirited jerks. Sadism was not too much a surprise coming from the group led by Orochimaru's godson. It was just another way in which they were alike. Even though it was familiar, or maybe because it was familiar, it was not at all comforting. He couldn't tell their most gracious hosts, and he said that in a sarcastic way, what he thought about them and their hospitality. If he found out, Orochimaru would be very upset. Everyone who followed the women knew that if she was unhappy, you were likely to be unhappy, too. She had a terrible habit of taking out her anger on her subordinates until she calmed down, got too tired to keep going, or ran out of people to hurt. He could talk about it from personal experience, which was a shame. He was sending other unfortunate people with his reports these days, just in case. Because even if his report was positive, her mood could be anything but something especially true when she first changed bodies. The difference in hormones between the two bodies hit her hard, and it took a few weeks for them to settle down properly. It had been an interesting week, though. There had been a lot of promotions, to fill new positions, a few recruitment drives, and he was pretty sure she had given one of the prisoners a birthday party. When he thought about that strange thing that had happened, his face relaxed a little, and a small, amused smile came naturally to his lips. Even though it could be seen as a bad thing most of the time, Orochimaru's bases were rarely dull. His mind was kept from thinking about how he felt about the wolves. Didn't they know how important first impressions are? He paid a little more attention to what was going on in the world. The middle of the concrete bridge they walked over was higher, so they could see the village not too far away. He didn't think they would go right through it, but it wasn't so big that he couldn't see most of it. Most of what was there should probably be changed, since there seemed to be a number of building projects going on to make the rather small town bigger. But if you looked at other villages in the world, this one was pretty small. Given how bad this place was a month ago when Gato was in charge, the growth was nothing short of amazing. The most successful businesses had bright neon lights hanging outside, and it looked like every building had electric lighting. Even though the town was small and had just been in a bad shape, a lot of people went about their business with a clear sense of happiness. Mist gently flowed out of the town's alleyways and into the newly paved streets, where it danced and tickled the heels of people walking by. That was both different and new. Paved roads. Most of the time, this kind of thing only happened inside compounds, like those for clans or palaces of lords. It was amazing that a whole town could have these paths in such a short amount of time. Even though Konoha was one of the wealthiest villages, it didn't bother to pave the streets because it was cheaper and easier to just leave them dirt. There were, however, some in the village when it first started, but that older area had become Konoha's red light district. When he thought about that, he could see the similarity. Even though most of the stores seemed trustworthy and he didn't see any suspicious people on the streets, probably because of the wolves, it still felt the same. Even though he didn't like the place he was in, he had to admit that the town looked pretty nice. Even though they were growing and changing, the bigger villages tried to hold on to their traditions as much as they could. Most small countries just couldn't afford to move forward. This, on the other hand, was a totally different story. Even though the town was small and young, it was rich, even though it hadn't quite gotten back to speed. Gato's stores gave out a lot of money, which helped the town grow, and this is what it looked like. A town, which would probably become a city soon, that didn't care where it came from but rather where it was going. Now it was time to build on top of what had already been done. Kabuto was very pleased.
I will continue the story in next part. Till then, we weeb offline.